The songs of the Yosemite winds and waterfalls are delightfully enriched with birdsong, especially in the nesting time of spring and early summer. The most familiar and best known of all is the common robin, who may be seen every day, hopping about briskly on the meadows and uttering his cheery and livening call. The black-headed grosbeak, too, is here, with the bullock oriole and western tanager, brown song sparrow, hermit thrush, the purple finch, a fine singer with head and throat of a rosy red hue, several species of warblers and vireos, kinglets, flycatchers, etc. But the most wonderful singer of all the birds is the water ouzel that dives into foaming rapids and feeds at the bottom, holding on in a wonderful way, living in a charmed life. That is the opening to chapter 9 of today's book, The Yosemite, written by John Muir. This is a collection of his diary. John Muir was very faithful in keeping track of his thoughts. He often wrote in a journal to talk about what happened that day. John Muir has been mentioned in several videos already, and I wanted to discuss this book because it is the only book I own that is about him specifically. This book is copyright 2001, introduction 2003. This is the 2003 Modern Library paperback edition. This Modern Library paperback classic is a facsimile of the first 1912 edition published by the Century Co. and includes, in a separate section, reproductions of the original photographs and a new rendering of the original fold-out map of Yosemite National Park. Now, who is John Muir? John Muir is a very famous preservationist in American history. In fact, he's almost the archetypal preservationist. He lived in the Yosemite Valley as a shepherd for some years and honestly hated them. He called them hoofed locusts because they just ate everything they could reach and never stopped eating. The bears in Yosemite Valley constantly ate the sheep because they were docile animals and were easy sources of protein and other nutrients that the bears needed. John Muir loved the Yosemite Valley, and it was through his tireless efforts that it was eventually protected both as a state-operated park within California and very soon after as a national park. He was a preservationist. I've discussed the difference between preservationists and conservationists in other videos, and I'm going to reiterate it here. A preservationist is someone who wholeheartedly believes in setting aside land for no use other than its existence as wilderness. Preservationists often care only about recreational use or maybe hunting to some degree, but generally want to keep human activity within that area to a minimum. Conservationists set aside land with the goal of human use, and specifically human use that furthers civilization's aims. So, national forests that are set aside for logging, for hunting, for recreation, for mining, for a wide variety of uses. Preservationists believe in setting aside land and using it minimally. Conservationists set aside land explicitly for human use. Muir, in this book, doesn't really discuss that. It's not political, it's not about his goals, it is more a book about his feelings for the Yosemite Valley. In the chapter titled Earthquake Storms, the ending says, But on the whole, by what at first sight seemed pure, confounded confusion and ruin, the landscapes were enriched, for gradually every talus was covered with groves and gardens, and made a finely proportioned and ornamental base for the cliffs. In this work of beauty, every boulder is prepared and measured, and put in its place more thoughtfully than are the stones of temples. If for a moment you are inclined to regard these taluses as mere draggled, chaotic dumps, climb to the top of one of them and run down without any haggling, puttering hesitation, boldly jumping from boulder to boulder. You will then find your feet playing a tune and quickly discover the music and poetry of these magnificent rock piles. A fine lesson. And all nature's wildness tells the same story. The shocks and outbursts of earthquakes, volcanoes, geysers, roaring, thundering waves and floods, the silent uprush of sap in plants, storms of every sort, each and all are the orderly, beauty-making love beats of nature's heart. Now, that's incredibly beautiful language, but as I mentioned earlier, I never actually finished this book. And the reason for that is when he's not waxing eloquently like that, his descriptions of the places he wanders is very slow and boring, and it drags on. I'll try to find a good example. Even as far north as the Fresno, I counted 536 saplings and seedlings growing promisingly upon a landslip not exceeding 2 acres in area. This soil bed was about 7 years old and had been seeded almost simultaneously by pines, firs, Lipocedrus and sequoia, presenting a simple and instructive illustration of the struggle for life among the rival species. And it was interesting to note that the conditions thus far affecting them have enabled the young sequoias to gain a marked advantage. So that's a paragraph on page 139 in the chapter The Big Trees. It's slow, it's lumbering, kind of like those trees. It's just kind of boring to read. Another complaint I have about this copy of this book is look at this typeset, the way the page is organized. There is so much empty space on the bottom of each page, and it doesn't really get lower than that. This book isn't incredibly long. It's only about 257 pages. But it is a slog at times. John Muir writes very beautifully, and it is that eloquence and descriptive quality of his that really captured people when he was setting up the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club is a group of preservationists that were started by John Muir in his attempt to preserve the Yosemite Valley. Instead, it was conserved. The Sierra Club has tried for the last century and change to really set aside land purely for preservation. And they've had their ups and downs, their failures and their successes. Oftentimes you will see the failure of Hetch Hetchy Dam or the Glen Canyon Dam, which I read about in another book, Lessons from the Arch Druid, I think is the name of that book. It's really sad what the Sierra Club was up against and how hard it is for them to preserve land for future generations to enjoy the sight of. But it is not the same as John Muir. And John Muir, his writing is very hard to get through. The Sierra Club, I've seen what they've sponsored, and they sponsor some really good writers. I have read some of that, and I've enjoyed a lot of it. But this book is really hard to enjoy because of how interestingly John Muir writes. Now, I only paid $7.50 for this, and this copy is in really good condition. There's no blemishes, there's no highlighting, there's not really any signs of use. But I just cannot finish it. If this is the kind of book you like, I would really recommend picking it up because John Muir does have some beautiful things to say, but it's not beauty I can entirely appreciate. So, this book, I never finished it, but I liked some of the portions I read and didn't like a lot of the other portions I read. I think maybe someone who is interested in the history of preservationist writing, you would enjoy this. And definitely some of the books I've discussed on this channel are paying homage to John Muir's legacy. And so I think if you've liked a lot of these books I've discussed, you're going to enjoy this one as well. It's not for me, but not all books are for everyone. So, yeah. My name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.